I'm going to, in my talk this morning, in my brief conversation, I'm going to really emphasize the degree of uncertainty in the direction of the future of work, and specifically the impact that technology is going to have on work in the future, and talk a little bit about how that affects our ability to plan and implement sensible policies when there's so much uncertainty in the future. And in the process of doing this, I'm going to reinforce many of the points that Steen just made. So technical change in the future, how do we frame the problems? I'm going to mention several different framings. The first being, there's just not going to be enough jobs in the future. Here the narrative, and this is the most, I think, extreme narrative out there, is that technical change is occurring at such a fast pace it's going to displace lots of workers, not enough work to go around. And here, if we think about if you think that is what is happening, then policy prescriptions that include a lot of social assistance for the unemployed, maybe that guaranteed income, makes sense, okay? If instead, the scenario that Steen outlined, clearly the one that OECD has embraced, is that there's enough jobs, but there's a big skills mismatch. The nature of the jobs, the skills required is really changing. Here the narrative is that technical change, sure, it displaces some workers, but it leads to productivity and income growth, and greater consumption and demand by workers. So this all generates more jobs, but the new skills, there are new skills required by the new jobs that are being created, and so there's this kind of friction in the labor market, this mismatch that people who are searching for work don't have the skills that employers are demanding, causes the unemployment. And here, the obvious policy prescriptions will focus on education and workforce skills development, lifelong learning. And finally, another narrative, a third narrative that I'll touch on this morning, is that the nature of the employment relationship is changing. So this could be consistent with either of the first two narratives, but somewhat separate. Steen touched on it as well. Here, technical change is really facilitating new forms of work. Workers are increasingly becoming free agents, or they're having flexible work schedules. For example, the advent of scheduling algorithms has really changed, in the United States at least, the way that workers in certain sectors, such as retail, hotel, and restaurants, kind of schedule their workforce. They become just-in-time workers. Okay? So that leads to a lot of flexibility, but shifts some of the risk onto workers. Similarly, Steen talked about the advent of online platforms, mobile apps that connect people directly to jobs. Why that is particularly important is because, by and large, these workers are considered legally self-employed. And that has all sorts of implications that I'll go into in a minute in terms of whether they're covered by labor and employment law and basic social insurance, okay? So here the policy prescriptions involve revisiting what some in the United States call the social compact. As was already mentioned, concerns about technical change are not new. There are many, many examples, but a more recent one was that in 1961, President Kennedy created the Office of Automation and Manpower in the U.S. Department of Labor, identifying, quote, "The major domestic challenge of the 60s is to maintain full employment at a time when automation, of course, is replacing men." Roughly 2 decades after this office was created, I happened to be in the U.S. Department of Labor's library and looked at the shelves of technical reports that were written around this time. And my reaction then was, how quaint. It's really interesting how, what that generation of people were focused on as the big problem in the workforce. So the lesson is that fashioning sensible policies requires knowing the current as well as the future trends and their causes. And as in the past, there's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and I'll argue a lot of misinformation about what's going on. So let me start off by saying what's happening right now. What are the big trends that have been linked to technical change? Automation, artificial intelligence, and the like. Okay, so one of the big trends is a shift in the occupational and industry structure of employment. In the United States, the most cited example is the precipitous decline in manufacturing employment in the early 2000s. It dropped by nearly 5 million jobs, nearly a 30% decline in a relatively short period of time. And the most common narrative in the United States is this just reflects automation of factories. But it turns out that this common narrative that's been spun in the newspapers and repeated by many academics as well as policymakers is based on a fundamental misreading of the manufacturing data, and the research evidence just doesn't support that a sudden technology shock caused this precipitous decline in manufacturing. And the point here is that, and there's a big debate on the extent to which it was globalization. But my point here is that whether it's trade, technology, or something else causing these big shifts really affects kind of what the mix of policies that you're going to pursue. I don't want to get into it here, but if you think that trade was a big factor in the United States, then it is somewhat understandable, and I don't want to condone or condemn my current administration's policies, but it makes, you can understand why there is a focus on that issue. Okay. A lot of misinformation, misunderstanding about what's going on, and it's actually very hard to parse out the effects of technology versus globalization and other factors. Okay. Growth and inequality, the common narrative is it reflects skill-biased technical change. As Louise and Steen have already mentioned, there's this growth of high-skilled jobs, growth of low-skilled jobs, and the middle-skilled have fallen out. But other forces like globalization and the financialization of publicly traded companies likely played important roles in that too. And again, it's just difficult to parse out the relative importance of various factors in these trends when the trends are occurring at the same time. And to some degree, they're interrelated. Okay. Third trend that's been already discussed is the growth of non-standard work. Here, the narrative is that technology has enabled flexible scheduling in the United States. One estimate suggests that about 11% of employees receive less than a week's notice about their following week's schedule. I've already mentioned mobile apps and online platforms are also evidence of new technologies. They still account, as best we know, it's not well measured, for a very small share of employment, at least in the United States. Most people think it is in the 0.1%, maybe 0.5%, but it could be growing rather quickly. But the evidence on, more generally, the growth of non-standard work in the United States is conflicting. And it's unclear whether there's been a general increase in recent years. We saw some figures for OECD. Very recently, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics came out with a new and much anticipated survey in which they tried to measure this, and it hadn't been done for 12 years. And there was widespread expectation there would be a big jump in most forms of this type of non-standard employment. And it turns out they didn't find any. If anything, they found a small decline. Okay? So this threw a great big wet blanket, at least in the United States, on many policymakers' interests in kind of addressing this issue, and it's really unclear whether it deserves an urgent policy response. It's an area that I specifically research. I think there's reasons why the BLS numbers, the Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers, aren't picking up some important trends. But anyway, To my point, there's just a lot of uncertainty about what's going on out there. Okay. Of course, the bottom line is that there's a lot of uncertainty about what currently is occurring, projecting future implications of technology on employment and the workplace are, of course, even more difficult. So, Steen already mentioned this or alluded to some of these studies, but if we look at future projections, kind of from a macro level, how many jobs in the future will be affected, there's a famous or widely cited study by Frey and Osborne that suggests that nearly half of all jobs of U.S. workers that are in jobs are currently in jobs that are susceptible to displacement from computerization. Another study by OECD, which I believe is the one that Steen was alluding to, takes a task-based approach. Okay, they say, well, jobs won't many jobs won't be fully eliminated by computerization, automation, artificial intelligence, but the nature of the tasks may change, and they estimate 6 to 12% of jobs in OECD countries are automatable. Big difference, a lot of uncertainty about how big the impact. The authors also note, I think it's very important, Steen already brought this up, that the share of jobs affected by automation is not the same as job employment losses. Why? Because technology may create new jobs, and job displacement really depends on the speed of introduction. Okay, if technology is being eliminated rather slowly, and jobs are being lost at a rather slow rate, then it's much easier to kind of place the people who are being displaced into new jobs. Large shocks are much more difficult to deal with. So moving on, these were big macro studies. I just want to spend a minute talking about a recent case study that was done, a very thorough report on what do we know about autonomous vehicles and their impact on job displacement, the future workforce. Here's a case where there's widespread agreement that this is happening, and it's going to happen in the near future. But there's still, in this study, very thorough study that's getting a lot of attention in the United States by Groshen and co-authors, suggests there's tremendous uncertainty about what's going to happen. The level of disruption and its timing depend on, as I just mentioned, the speed of introduction, the number of workers affected, and the regional concentration of those impacts. Again, emphasizing this point, large, concentrated employment shocks can overwhelm a local economy and hamper workers' adjustment. So it's important not just to know how many jobs are going to be affected. It's sort of over what time horizon. That makes a big difference in our workforce programs' ability to avoid large displacements and dislocated worker problems. Thank you. So, just to quickly summarize some of the findings of this case study, the direct effects were estimated at 1.3 to 2.3 million jobs over the next 30 years, and were relatively small in any given year. So they were saying that you wouldn't really notice it before 2030, and the maximum impacts would start in the 2040s. That's a long time from now, okay? And you're having 100,000 at the maximum impact. They projected 100,000 jobs per year. And for some perspective, the U.S. lost over 3 million manufacturing jobs in 7 years and 8 million jobs during the Great Recession. So just from this alone, is it important? Yes. Is it going to change a lot of things? Yes. But it certainly doesn't suggest that there's a big crisis on our doorstep. They also they mentioned that they're not going to look at indirect effects. Many drive as part of their job, such as home health aides. They didn't look at these employment impacts because they say it's just too hard to know what's going to happen. There will be macro effects that I've already mentioned. It may stimulate new jobs, result in higher demand, older individuals will be more mobile and so forth. Just hard to know overall what's going to happen. Okay, so let me turn now to my final set of slides, which are sort of how do we think about policy, given all of this uncertainty about what's happening even in the present, but particularly about the future. I would say that given this uncertainty, policy prescriptions need to be focused on general principles and ensuring that basic systems, the basic infrastructure is in place to help workers. Okay, so I'll just do a light touch on each of the main topics that we're going to be covering. Great, perfect. In this conference, education. So clearly here, the implications for curricula depend on what tasks and skills are made obsolete by new technology. Recently in the United States, there was a big move to focus on math and sciences in high schools, okay? And vocational training and English and history were kind of got it, particularly vocational training. So it was kind of a college for all approach, and there's a big backpedaling now in the United States occurring because it is believed this doesn't suit everyone. My point here is that we need to be cautious with so much uncertainty about what's happening to move too strongly in one direction or another. Workforce development. The United States ranks at or near the bottom of all OECD countries in expenditures on active labor market programs, a little bit under 0.1% of GDP expenditures. Incidentally, the United States' focus on, or lack of focus rather, on active labor market programs really reflects evidence-based research that suggested that the most cost-effective policies were to place workers quickly in jobs. Training was expensive and not cost-effective. That may be changing. There's considerable support for making a more robust system of training, lifelong learning to address changing skills demands. And what I also should want to mention that in these cases, the policies that you would adopt for workforce training really aren't so sensitive to whether the shocks to labor, changing demand are coming from technology, trade, or other factors. Congress is considering currently a big increase in $1 billion for adult skills training. This is in response to the threat of new technology. Rather, it's in response to a Republican administration's desire to make work a requirement to receive food assistance. And then they realize that many people are unemployable with their current set of skills, so they're providing training. But this perhaps could grow or start to develop a robust system of training, more robust system of training in the United States. I would argue in the area of employment regulations and protections, even if the United States is not experiencing a strong increase in non-standard work arrangements, evidence suggests that already, and for many years, the incidence has been very high. Many workers are outside the system of employment protections that were designed, many of which were designed nearly 100 years ago. And so there's a growing consensus to address those. Cities, for example, in the United States are experimenting with regulations to require minimum advance notice about work schedules. This is in Seattle and New York City. I think where some of the most robust evidence exists is that independent contractor arrangements are growing in the United States, including this sort of new technology-enabled gigs, Uber, Mechanical Turk, and the like. What's important here is because, at least in the United States, these workers are classified as self-employed, they fall completely outside of any labor and employment regulations. They don't receive workplace benefits. And there's some consensus that a social compact needs to be updated. And finally, a policy area if you think that there's just tremendous uncertainty about what is actually happening and what the future of work looks like, is collecting more and better information. And Louise mentioned that this was already being implemented in Canada. And it's actually, it sounds rather drab, but it's a very important point. There are a couple of bills currently pending in the U.S. Congress that would be directing the U.S. Department of Commerce and the U.S. Department of Labor to provide regular reports on what was happening, the adoption of new technology in our country, and what the workforce implications were. So with that, I will stop. Thank you.